That's our new little intro. I want to say thank you to everybody for helping put that together. Welcome back to our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, writers, academics on the left, academics on the right, academics from Southern universities, Midwest universities, middle of America, and the elite coast universities. With us today, it is my privilege to have Professor Kevin Smith. He's a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Professor Smith studies the biology and psychology of individual level differences in political attitudes and behaviors. We're going to be talking about that today. In other words, he is interested in why some people are passionate about politics while others couldn't care less. Where conservatives and liberals get their political beliefs from, why those beliefs are so resistant to change, and how those beliefs drive choices and actions. He also retains a strong interest in public policy and state politics, which were his primary research interests during the first part of his academic career. This is the book where I found him. We talked to some of his other colleagues, and we'll be getting to that in just a second. Here's a brief description. Professor, did I say anything wrong about your background? Is there something I need to correct? This is what I could find. I tried to find your CV, but this is what I could find.
No, I think that's a pretty good capsule description of who I am and what I do. I'm primarily make my crust as a political psychologist studying attitudes and behaviors, but I also still have a strong foot in the field of public policy. That's kind of my jam.
Okay, so you're both public policy and oops, sorry, let me do it. Both public. I just want to, public policy and psychology. That's brilliant. So what is this book about, briefly, and why is it important? And if you could, I know I load these questions up, but why did you write this? Why was this an important book? Why write it now? Why not 10 years in the past or wait 2 years in the future? Why was it important to get to this topic? And why was it timely to discuss this now?
Well, to start with the last part of your question first, I mean, it's a timely topic because we're certainly going through an era by any metric of increasing partisan polarization. Increasingly, people don't just agree to disagree on public policy. They're sort of like splitting up into partisan tribes. We can kind of see that in an obvious sense with what's happening around the presidential election campaign cycle right now. But even when elections aren't going on, people are pretty divided over politics. And I think one of the common mistakes that people on both sides make is that, if people on the other side, people who disagree with me, if I could just sit down with them, if they just had access to the same information that I had, and they just saw the world the way that I see it, they would agree with me, or at least their position would move a lot closer to mine. And kind of like one of the driving motivations of the book is we think, and that there is a tremendous amount of scholarly evidence for that is simply an inaccurate assumption and description about the way that our human psychology works in the field of human politics. And to take even one step further, the assumption about how people come to their political attitudes and opinions, how they come to adopt a particular ideology is, we think, and the book has a lot of evidence to back up this point, incorrect. That our political attitudes and opinions at a very fundamental level are rooted in emotion, and more specifically, they're rooted in predispositions. And what we mean by that is that we are psychologically and even biologically primed to find some political messages more pleasing to us, and other political messages where we're primed to be more likely to feel uncomfortable with them or just reject them outright.
I remember something called the rational man hypothesis in college, and it was the idea that people act rationally. Of course, they want to do the best. They want to make the best decisions, so they'll always act rationally in everything. And then I remember a thing called the 2008 global financial collapse, where they actually studied all the bankers and the Federal Reserve, and they go, how come all you guys missed this?
Yeah.
And what they found out was what you said. The data's there, but they're more packaged by emotion. Basically, a lot of the bankers and the Federal Reserve chairman didn't want to be the odd man out and say something no one else was saying. And so to fit in, they just didn't bring it up. And that's why we got into the recession.
Yeah.
Nationally, they didn't act on the data.
And sort of like the story of why I ended up having sort of like this schizophrenic academic research agenda of public policy and psychology kind of like is related directly to the point that you're making. You know, I cut my teeth as a young assistant professor back in the mid 1990s looking at state level public policies. Like I was very interested in criminal justice policy and crime policy, for example, but also education. And at the time, exactly what you were describing was the primary method or the primary theoretical lens through which academics viewed policy. It was in academia, it was called public choice, but its first assumption was that people are rational.
Public
and
choice.
I kept getting up at academic conferences and saying, this doesn't make any sense. We're doing things like reordering the educational system and locking up hundreds of thousands of people on the assumption of rationality. And I don't know human beings who actually think and behave and act like that. And the response that I kept getting, where I sort of like have my little soapbox speech, was like, okay, smart guy, what's your theory of where people come to their attitudes and behaviors and make their choices from? And at that kind of struck me mute, because I hadn't got one. And so what I started to do is, you know, I read quite a lot in economics, but I started also reading broadly in psychology. That really rapidly took me to evolutionary psychology. And then, you know, I went all the way back to Darwin and even Lamarck. And I increasingly became convinced that, you know, if you're going to study public policy seriously in terms of trying to affect people's behavior and choices, what you need to pay attention to is more the psychology of humans than this notion of economic rationality that we're getting out of economics. And so I started to think all sorts of weird thoughts about which way my career should go. And it just so happened that independently, 2 doors down from me was one of the co-authors on that book, John Hibbing.
Okay.
And we, purely by accident, were eating lunch with a group of our colleagues one day, and John turned to me and said, what are you working on, Kevin? What are you thinking about these days? And I sort of like sheepishly told him what I was reading and what I was thinking about. And of course, John being John, he was 2 years ahead of me. So that's kind of like how the collaboration happened. And both of us, I mean, John is a very, very well-known institutional scholar. He was one of the nation's leading congressional scholars.
Right.
And John and I and another colleague at Rice University, John Alford, we effectively spent the next 15, nearly 20 years basically investigating the biology and psychology of ideology, of political attitudes and behaviors. But my introduction to it, I came into it, it was like an utterly happy accident. It was frustration about not being able to have a coherent answer to, you know, if humans aren't rational, what are they?
So we're giving up the rational man theory going back to 1790, 1723, taught to me when I was in college in the 1990s. Disproven, in my opinion, roughly around 2008. And we're going to the evolutionary psychology behavior. And it seems like what you're saying in this book is that, and I've heard this, if I could just get this information in front of these people, clearly they have a different opinion on the issue. They must not be seeing the right data. They must not have the right information. That's the only logical explanation as to why they could come to this. And I think what you're saying is, no, their opinions are based in deep psychology, emotion, predispositions, the way that they were raised, the area that they were raised in. And changing their opinion is not going to be boy, if I could just get the right facts to them, they'd poof, know they were wrong. Is that roughly a fair
Yeah,
summary?
and I think the proof in the pudding of that is anyone who has had a conversation about a political issue with someone that they disagree with is that trying to change people's political views where they have a distinct, that they have a position is incredibly hard. I mean, can it be done? Absolutely. We're talking about, predispositions, not destiny. But it is really hard to change people's political opinions. People don't update their prior beliefs in the way that you would think a purely rational animal would. And one of the things that you had up there was Adam Smith, who is often associated with the sort of like the rational choice model. But, Adam Smith didn't just write The Wealth of Nations. He also wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which effectively predates the arguments that we're making by a couple of centuries. Trying to, what Smith was trying to do in that book was try to understand, the parts of human psychology that are associated with making decisions of right and wrong. And when you're in the political realm, that is basically what it's all about. This is right and that is wrong.
So I have heard from a lot of professors that, and I guess I'm going to challenge the theory. I agree with you, but I want to, just for the sake of the audience, I want to challenge the theory. So I've heard from numerous professors saying the opposite. Boy, if we could just get more of these conservatives and liberals to talk to each other. Stanford University has, this is the book, I believe, correct, Professor?
Yes, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Yep.
I didn't know that. Thank you for educating me. That's why I love doing the show. I always learn something. The theory was, wow, if we could, there's something called the Encounter Group out of Stanford University or something like that. And there's other universities pursuing this. And the theory is, if we could just bring liberals and conservatives together. And they were doing something like having liberals and conservatives share beer.
Yeah.
Not even talk about politics, just share beer. Maybe they'd have them meet and discuss community issues for a year. And it always ended up the same. You stopped feeling harshly to the person that you were meeting, but the moment you went back home, you still had all the same political opinions about everything. Before, you just kind of placed that person you were meeting outside of the group, and then you kept your opinions about the group. Why do so many professors seem to think that if we can just get everybody together, they'll come together, we'll have a consensus? Why do political experts still think that we're in campaign season and still say, oh, if I could just talk to them and they could just know, oh, they don't know these facts. This seems such a compelling belief that if people just had the information and if we could just have them talk to each other, that everything would be coming together. And I don't see as many people using the theory that I'm gravitating to, which is the one you're selling, which is this is inherent in us. It's not a simple conversation snaps someone out.
Yeah, I think those sort of exercises are still worthwhile because I think one of the things that, goes along with the increasingly polarized world that we live in is that people on both sides often have wildly inaccurate views of the other side.
Okay.
And one of the, I think, very constructive things that can come out of, discussing your differences is that a lot of people effectively realize it's like, well, they're not as extreme as I thought they were. And I think that's a very, very useful and constructive thing to do. It essentially helps build a bridge to, talking about differences in an environment of civility and comity. And Lord knows we need a little bit more of that these days. But when it comes to sort of like changing fundamental opinions, yeah, I just don't think that's going to happen. I mean, will it happen occasionally? Sure. We're not talking about the notion that people are pre-programmed and cannot change their minds. I mean, individuals still have agency, but persuading, I mean, like, if you have a progressive liberal and a MAGA conservative get down together, the notion that one of them is going to walk out of there completely turned around, I think that's pretty naive. I mean, one of the points that we really try to drive home in this book is that there's an awful lot of evidence out there that suggests that liberals and conservatives literally see the world differently. Not metaphorically, they literally see the world differently. They tend to pay attention to different things. They weight the importance of the same stimuli differently. They are more likely to draw different inferences from uncertain situations. And those things, I mean, even if you point them out to people, it's still a struggle to get them to see the world from a different perspective. And I mean, one of the things, I mean, we're pretty upfront about this in the book. And, and when we first started publishing these studies, people thought we were crazy, and we were challenged on it pretty hard.
Okay.
But ideology is heritable. Ideology is heritable. And not only is it heritable, I mean, that's non-controversial to say these days. I mean, everything is heritable. I mean, everything is heritable. But even then, ideology is more heritable than many other psychological traits. It's more heritable than sexual orientation, for example. And when we first started publishing these studies, the two Johns were on one of the first studies, and I was on a bunch of them following. People would say this cannot be true. Politics is all about the current social environment. It's all about where you were, how your parents socialized you, what schools you went to, and whatnot. It cannot have a biological component. But I think that's much less controversial to say these days. I mean, people who argue that ideology and your political attitudes are not partially under the influence of your genetics, the onus of proof is now on them, because the evidence that we have from different methods, so like from quantitative genetics or basic twin studies, from adoption studies, and from genome-wide association scans, they all tend to triangulate on the same conclusion, that roughly 40 to 60% of the variance that we observe in ideology in populations seems to be under genetic influence. And this isn't one study, it's not two studies, it's a whole bunch of studies using different methods. And, I'm a scientist. I mean, if there is, there's brilliant new stream of research that comes out and suggests that there's some flaw in all of this other research, I'll update my beliefs. But until that happens, and I'm pretty skeptical that it will happen, I mean, the strong weight of evidence seems to suggest that our political orientations are deeply, deeply embedded in us, it's for sure in our psychology and maybe even in our biology.
I've seen some people start to recognize that. Obviously, some of your other professors, I just find it interesting that the rational man theory and everybody acts rationally has been around for hundreds of years, literally. And now we're finally getting to the concept that perhaps human beings, which are just an animal, we're another type of smart ape. We're 2% different from chimpanzees, 1% different from bonobos.
Yeah.
That we're still, I mean, you can watch animals with dogs where if the puppies bark a lot, the mother dog will start growling at them to get them to be quiet and lie down. My mom's done that to me and my brother a lot. So why do we think we're so much more elevated? We're a form of intelligent animal. It makes more sense to me that we would be driven by biological impulses and programming rather than rational discourse. But I see that we're having trouble at the academic level moving that needle all the way on that. Obviously, there's some people who are where you're at. How do we get most of America, people who talk on TV? Because if I watch MSNBC and CNN and Fox, they're going to tell me if I could just get these people to know these facts, their media network won't let them know this. How do we get to the point where we have a majority of people in America operating under the theory that you're talking about, where that's not how you're going to make change. It's going to have to be a more emotional, value-based sentiment. You can't just assume these people are stupid and ignorant, and if you just got the right information in front of them and their leaders stop lying to them, that they immediately snap to. I see everybody saying that. Now, maybe it's campaign season, but how do we cause this shift to where we get America to recognize how this actually works, that we can actually have a productive conversation about fixing it instead of going back to old theories that are 2 centuries old?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not even sure if it's about going back to old theories. It's the at the heart of your question is essentially how can we sort of like disagree more agreeably and sort of
Right.
like engage with each other more constructively. And
Right.
boy, if I had the simple answer to that $64,000 question, I wouldn't be talking with you, Marcus. I'd be making a lot of money.
Okay. All right.
Spreading that sort of stuff. But I think there are a couple of things that are important to addressing the really important question that you're raising. I mean, one, I think leadership is important. If the people who are the legislative and elected leaders can model good behavior and sort of like defend that social norm, I think that could help. And I don't think that's as Pollyannish or naive as it seems. I think we've seen examples of this in fairly recent history. The 2 presidential campaigns that Barack Obama ran, one was against John McCain and one was against Mitt Romney. And, there's no doubt there's some sharp elbowed partisanship going on there.
Right.
There was some mudslung, but fundamentally, you got the sense here's 2 decent people who respect each other's views, but just disagree sharply over what we should do to address the nation's problem. And in particular, I'm remembering it was John McCain, and I forget what it was at a town hall or something. And
I don't trust those Muslims. And he goes, he's a good man.
Yeah, and a lady got up, and John McCain was very clear. He said, Barack Obama is not my enemy. Barack Obama is my opponent. He's a good American, and I just happen to disagree with him on these things. And I think that can help if that is modeled. And then the other big thread here is we live in a strange information environment now, like the role of social media and, giving platforms to a multitude of voices. And in some ways that's great because some of those voices weren't heard under a traditional mainstream media model.
Right.
But, you essentially have people monetizing outrage and, putting out clickbait rather than, trying to contribute in any constructive way.
Right.
And I mean, we all know now that, a lot of those social media algorithms are specifically designed to play upon the emotional psychology of humans. And that sort of like, feeds into a self-reinforcing feedback loop. I mean, I think that's contributing to it. But, having pointed out those 2 things, what do you do about them? Yeah, here's where I'm sort of like, well, I start shrugging my shoulders. I mean, I don't know how you get, elected leaders to start acting, more in line with what John McCain modeled.
I'm sorry, Professor. I should have told you. We're only taking absolute answers and complete answers to solve all of America's problems on the show. So
okay, well,
we have the total. What's the total working solution that we can implement tomorrow?
Okay, well,
snap everything back into place, Professor.
Well, in that case, Marcus, you're interviewing the wrong guy.
Whoops.
I'll need to write another book.
Can you tell me what professor does understand this perfectly and has all the solutions to fix all the problems in America politically?
Well, and that's one other thing. In all seriousness, anyone like me or anyone in the media or anyone in the political world who says anything like, I've got the solution to this, my response would be to be extremely skeptical of that, because there's a lot of people, plenty of them way smarter than me, that have been looking at this issue, that have not managed to sort of like resolve the complexities of human psychology that are needed in order to address what, let's face it. I mean, political polarization is a pretty serious social problem right now.
So it sounds like to me you're saying no one has figured out the definitive answer and is confident enough to walk out there and go, I've got the answer. This is it. This is how we fix all of America.
Yeah, the questions of sort of like how we solve America is like, I'm not even sure that is the right question. I'm not sure that America needs solving. I mean, one of the things that I sort of like really try to reinforce with my undergraduates, because a lot of them kind of have the notion that if we got political polarization is inherently bad, and it's not even inherently bad. I mean, if we define polarization as policy disagreements, that's no biggie. Democratic institutions, that's what they're set up to handle. If we're polarized in the sense of, I hate you if you disagree with me, and I will try to get you canceled, I'll try to get you fired, I will smear your reputation because I just hate you. That's not a recipe for social cohesion or social stability. So how we, retain and are okay with the former while sort of like lowering the temperature on the latter, I think that's the big challenge. And I mean, one way that people like me can play a role in that is not necessarily through writing books or anything, it's through teaching. One of the things that I see in my students year after year after year is that the average 20-year-old, when you get them to think seriously about politics, which is hard enough to do, they tend to have this viewpoint that the point of the democratic process is to solve or resolve conflict. And that's not its point. It's to manage it. It's to keep conflict within a certain set of navigational beacons. And those navigational beacons consist of institutions and social norms. And what we need to be really careful about is not undermining those institutions or abandoning those social norms that allow the democratic process to manage conflict. Because once we abandon those norms, once we've undermined those institutions, man, they're going to be awfully hard to stitch back together again. And a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in the book, in terms of predispositions, and effectively this is a predisposition to be tribal, right? You let those predispositions run wild where there's no norm constraints or institutional constraints, it's probably a bad, it probably forecasts bad things for the republic.
So as I like to ask some professors, there is a point where Humpty Dumpty cannot be put back together, right? That we can get to a point where it's gotten so bad, you're not putting everything back into place. Is that a fair summary?
Yep, I think that's a fair summary. I mean, the debate is over how close we are to that tipping point.
That's my next question. So some professors have said, Mark, relax. We had the Civil War, we survived. We had the 1960s. It's pretty violent, pretty upset. It's nowhere near as violent as the 1960s, so everything's going to be just fine. But then I met other professors who said, okay, there's some truth there. Civil War was much more violent. The 1960s had more political bombings, police officers being shot. But what was different was that now we have people who don't share a common faith in institutions. That wasn't the case in the 1960s. So now you have, I defy the guy you elected being president. I don't believe he won. I defy the Supreme Court making rulings. I don't want to listen to Congress. I don't feel like listening to police officers in the same thing. And that wasn't the case in the 60s. You didn't have people saying, we're going to deny that your guy won the presidency for 4 years. And then you can deny our guy won the presidency for 4 years. And then if the Supreme Court makes a ruling that we don't like, we'll just say across the nation, we're just going to ignore the law and ignore the Supreme Court. You do have people saying that. And so I've heard professors saying there's not the same common faith in institutions today as there was in the 1960s. And so the 60s may be more violent, but we may be more turbulent in that we don't have a national common belief that this is the election, that's Prez. This is the Supreme Court, that's the law. We're starting to do this thing where, like, that's your president. That's your Supreme Court ruling. I'll just, quote, defy it. Here in California, we had the lieutenant governor of the world's 5th largest economy go on TV and say, I defy the Supreme Court. I've never seen language like that in my life. 46. So would you agree that that might be new and bad?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, being the typical academic that I am, I think where my own perspective on these things would be sort of like midpoint between the two sides that you explained. I mean, I think, over the past 5 or 10 years, the institutions have taken a pretty good kicking, and I think they're holding. I mean, they're functioning as they are supposed to. James Madison and the rest of those guys, the Constitutional Convention, set up a system that is pretty resilient to, the sort of like unpleasant things that can be unleashed by a very polarized electorate. And we're certainly not at the point where, or at least I certainly hope we're not at the point where we're about to break out into a bloody civil war. But also some of the stuff that you mentioned, I think, is new, sort of like the refusal to recognize the legitimate outcome of an election is something new and unusual. That is a violation of a huge norm within our democracy. And you look at, Richard Nixon's concession in 1960, Al Gore's in 2000, and Hillary Clinton's in 2016. And I mean, clearly, these concessions were made through gritted teeth, but they did concede. Under our system, the other guy won, and that refusal to accept the outcome of a legitimate election. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is I am aware of any evidence that suggests that there was any sort of like broad scale fraud or anything like that. As far as I can tell, it was a legitimate election. That's a pretty dangerous precedent to set, and that sort of thing is a reason to worry.
Obviously, Donald Trump said, doubt the election with Biden. I won, he didn't. And like you said, there was not really a whole lot of evidence for that. There were some people claiming there's some mischief in Arizona and Georgia, but we never really saw hard evidence of that. And even members of his own crew who backed him initially, after a couple months, backed off and said, it's not here. We need to move on. But he didn't do it. So that's wrong.
And but the upside to this, Marcus, is some of the heroes, in my opinion, of the 2020 election were Republican election officials. I mean, most notably Brad Raffensperger down in Georgia, who basically stood up and defended the electoral process, even when there was a pretty significant reputational and perhaps even career cost to them. And I think they should be recognized.
Sure. I do want to point out, though, that while Trump did that, and that's bad and destabilizing, he was not the only one. Here's Hillary Clinton saying Biden should not concede the election under any circumstances.
Yeah, and this is
on television.
Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. That's
not productive either, right, Professor?
Yeah, once these norms start to erode, in other words, the precedent is set, that leads to bad places. And now, it can end up in a place where both sides are saying the only legitimate election is one where my side won. And that's not how democracy is supposed to work. If you lose an election, I mean, the biggest responsibility in a democratic electoral process falls on the loser's burden. You have to be willing to bear the burden of a loss. And the way that a democracy works is, an election is not the end of the game. It's just the end of a play. I lost this time, need to go back, lick my wounds, think about why we lost. What can we shift? What should we shift to get a majority of voters to vote for us next time? And my team will get another shot at the next election.
Right.
And that process is iterative. And, people increasingly see elections as kind of like these zero-sum games, not just a checkpoint in a never-ending process. And I think that can lead, especially at the elite level, if the elites start to buy into these norms that, elections are only legitimate when we win. Yeah, that's going to lead to some not very good places.
I remember when Obama was elected, that Texas famously talked about how they would want to secede, which kind of doesn't. And I remember that being kind of new. Like California did it with Trump. Texas said, "Oh, Obama's here. We're going to secede." But then I also remembered. Let me see if I can find this. Yeah. So obviously the Republicans, a majority of them did acknowledge, that the election was won by 2020 by Biden, which is unfair. But Hillary Clinton does this. And then we also saw recently the Democrats ran a game in 2020 where Trump won. And they basically said, well, it results in California seceding. And they put that out right before the election, almost as if like a threat, like if Trump wins, America's going to fall apart. So both sides seem to have participated in a little bit of hyperbolic language. Does this get better? Do we calm down naturally? We calmed down after the 1960s. What I want to ask you before you answer is, nobody that I talked to predicted January 6th would happen. Mm-hmm. Not one. Well, maybe one or two out of a couple hundred. But basically nobody did. How do we know there's not going to be a second January 6th and a third and a fourth, since the first one caught us off guard? And how do we know that we fix our problems and return to a workable level of political polarization before Jan 6, number 5?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, are we going to have another January 6th sort of event? Is I don't know. I mean, my crystal ball isn't more functional than anyone else's. Maybe Nate Silver or Nate Cohn is a better person to ask about that. I tend to rely on their statistics.
Nate Silver got the 2020 and 2016 election wrong and had to admit his models didn't work. But please.
One of the ways in which I talk to various groups and I talk to my students, and I don't want to play down the significance of something like a presidential election, because when a president gets elected, it can affect people's lives. If you're an undocumented immigrant, for example, I mean, it makes a difference in, how you feel and whether you feel targeted, depending on which president gets elected. If you're concerned about abortion rights, or if you're concerned about gun rights, it makes a difference, right? But for the vast majority of Americans, the day after the presidential election, the world's going to turn, the sun's going to come up, and your day just isn't going to be that much different. For the average American, politics is not going to change your life in terms of your day-to-day experience by much, if at all. And if I'm right about that, it gives plenty of people space to sort of swing back to a place where temperatures are cooler after an election. And I mean, I think we're already starting to see some signs that we, and I want to be careful about this because,
Thank you. There it is.
6 months from now, we might be talking about riots in the streets and why I was wrong about that.
That's the thing. January 6th caught everyone off guard. I'm not just saying that to be cute. A lot of people I talk to were professors of political science, had studied this for years, and they were all caught off guard. What that tells me is that none of us is really in the position to say it can't happen, since none of us predicted it was going to happen in the first place. I believe a professor who says, I predicted January 6th for these reasons, I called it out, and now I don't think it'll happen. No one did that. Everybody's like, I never thought something like that could happen, and I was shocked. So if the experts were caught that off guard across America, how do we know they're not going to do it again? How do we know they're not downplaying it again? They're going to be surprised again in 6 months and surprised again in 2 years.
Well, the short answer is we don't. You know,
Thank you.
the future is uncertain, and you know, predicting the future is in some ways a mug's game, because it's a
Well said.
multivariate universe, and there's a lot of
Well
stuff
said.
that can happen. I mean, one of the things that I guess is a little concerning, that sort of like supports and feeds into the point that you're making, and it touches on something that you mentioned a little while ago, and that's there's sort of like a fraying of a communal story. You know, there's increasingly people tend to think of themselves as hyphenated Americans, or they tend to think of themselves as members of one political tribe versus the other political tribe. And I think there's less of a sense that, you know, there's this broad shared agreement about this is what America is, this is what it means to be Americans, and we all agree on these values. And I might disagree with you on a lot of stuff, but if we share this, you know, the belief in the same project of the republic. And there seems to be less of that these days. I mean, you know, this has been, in strands of the progressive left, this has been a long-term project. You know, basically we need to tear the system down and start over again. I mean, what concerns me is that that's also a project that increasingly seems to be a part of the political right. Is, you know, we need to tear it down, and at least from the right, it's sort of like they at least sort of like try to slap a fig leaf of constitutionalism on it. But, you know, some of the stuff that they talk about doesn't strike me as that constitutional.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But if you've got both, you know, both of the major flavors of politics are sort of like drifting towards this. It's like, this isn't working. We need to tear down the institutions. We need to tear down the norms. That's just not a healthy place to be in. That's just not a healthy place to be in. I mean, typically what traditionally has happened is conservatives, small c conservatives, I'm not talking about the Republican Party, because I think large sections of the Republican Party now, you could argue, are not small c conservatives. But effectively, the role of conservatives was to defend those institutions, to defend those norms, to defend the way that we've always done things. And the role of progressives and people on the left was to point out, well, you know, if we keep this institution and this norm, this is unjustly affecting this group of people in a way that sort of like undermines the values that you say you're upholding. And the conservatives would grit their teeth and say, yeah, you're right. So let's move the goalposts a little bit, because we have to take care of that. And then, you know, the republic would evolve. But at periods of our history, there's been like those, you know, for lack of a better term, baby steps just aren't satisfying anybody. And that's when you get sort of like punctuated equilibrium. You get a civil war. You get, you know, Watts riots and all the upheaval that we saw in the 60s. And you get, quite frankly, what we're seeing some of today. I mean, certainly not to that extent, at least not yet. But, you know, politics is, I mean, I think this is an objective observation rather than a subjective interpretation. Politics has just gotten uglier.
You know, that's everybody's saying that. Well, almost everybody. Yeah, I met like two people who were like, "Oh, it's rough and tumble." And don't you remember when John Adams called George Washington a transvestite who rode a donkey into Congress? And yeah, that's there, but it seems to be getting worse. I'm wondering where you're going the way that I was hoping this would go. How do we know it gets better? The thing that I keep coming back to was that in 2020, Joe Biden said there will be a, quote, national calming after I'm elected. And those Republicans who back Trump will realize they were wrong, and the Trump supporters will realize they were wrong, and we'll all come together. He was saying things like, we're not enemies, we're Americans. It's time to put away the harsh rhetoric and to lower the temperature and to see each other, listen to each other, make progress, stop treating each other as opponents or enemies. After he said this, January 6th happened, and now 4 years later, you and I are having a conversation about how the climate continues to deteriorate. Obviously, Donald Trump is a big part of that, but I also noticed things by like the Democrats. So this is Jasmine Crockett. She's very popular. The Democrats will routinely talk about her. Before Donald Trump almost got shot in the head on national television, she suggested that it would be cool that he not have Secret Service protection so that he would be open to assassination attempts. When she was called and said, that's extreme, she said, hell yes, I'm saying it. And after Donald Trump got shot at, she still refused to back down on the suggestion. And she's widely supported by the Democrats, who have not criticized this language at all. Professor, is this the kind of things that we see in a stable country that's going to good places in the future?
Well, the short answer to that is, especially when you've got not just rhetoric involved, but you have people actually taking pot shots at presidential candidates. No, that's not something that you typically associate with a stable, healthy, functioning, liberal, civil democracy. And I think you were talking about the remarks that Biden made. The notion that after an election we're all going to sit down together and sing Kumbaya, I think that is a little naive. But I think it is reasonable, or at least I hope it's reasonable, to expect or even assume that candidates for office who lose will bear the loser's burden, that they are willing to bear the loser's burden. And if you have candidates who are, across the board systemically refusing to bear the loser's burden, your democracy is probably in trouble. I mean, it's going to undermine the legitimacy of elections.
Like when Hillary Clinton said, along with Trump, don't concede the election.
Yeah, like when anyone says that.
That's not a good sign.
If there is, and I think I'm unaware of any evidence that suggests that there is any major sort of like corruption or flaw in the electoral process in the United States. Now, am I saying that every vote is counted exactly accurately? No. I mean, you're on a presidential election, you're talking about tens of millions of votes. Humans run this process. There's almost some error. But I don't see anything systematic going on to where we should not trust our electoral process in terms of sort of like delivering a result that is truly reflective of the people who voted. If you have a system like that, and you have candidates that are basically saying, yeah, this system doesn't work because I lost, it's clearly fraudulent, and people start to lose faith in the system, then it doesn't matter how good your electoral process is. Once faith in that system has gone, faith in the electoral system, essentially what you're talking about is faith in democracy is gone. And things can get a little shaky if that happens.
So about half the country appears to have lost faith in the elections, if we're looking at the election, political tally. I know it's a little bit hard to go the exact percentage, but if you look at the largely Trump base of supporters, he's been saying that for years. The Republicans who criticized them have walked back some of the condemnations, just like the Republican Party walked back their condemnation of January 6th. So they were condemning him, and then they started to walk it back. So what does that say when there's two political parties, they're roughly equal, and one of them thinks, yeah, last two elections were rigged? Is that stable?
One of the, let me try to shed a little sunshine into this.
Please.
One thing that I would, if you press hard on that opinion data about faith in the election process, I think there are a lot of people who are suspicious about the electoral process broadly, but are still pretty confident in it locally. Like out here in Nebraska, I mean, there are some people worried about voter ID and that sort of thing, but there's a general recognition that, yeah, our elections run pretty cleanly. We're not the problem. But
Sure.
if Donald Trump is losing, or Hillary Clinton is losing, or whoever is losing, my candidate is losing, somewhere else, somebody's electoral system must be off. Somebody's rigging it. So I'm not sure how. I mean, I'm reminded of sort of like the split in public opinion about public education. I mean, if you look at public opinion polls, people are like, "Oh yeah, public schools are in such a mess." Well, how's your public school? Oh yeah, my public school's pretty good. I think there might be that kind of an element, and you can understand why, because people, the messages that people are getting about the electoral system, and indeed about the public education system, that you get in the news or through social media, it's very rarely good stuff. It's
Right.
usually bad stuff.
Right.
And I mean, I think it's, I mean, I don't think it's an unwarranted inference to take from the information that you're getting that something's got to be wrong somewhere, because I keep hearing all this bad stuff.
I wonder if it's getting better. I see people have told me we survived the 1860s, we survived the 1960s. Come on, this is America. But then I see things like Congress members saying, let's not have Secret Service protection for presidents. Presidents almost getting their head blown off. And then the Democratic Party saying, no need to criticize anything about that or suggest anything. Yeah, multiple attempts on a president's life, but we don't need to criticize any of our members talking like that. I also see things like this. This was last year. Historically low faith in U.S. institutions continues, as that article puts it out. Basically, they're saying, find that again. Let's see here. Many institutions at or near rock bottom. Only 4 institutions have a confidence score significantly above their historic low: the military, small business, organized labor, and banks. So if you're not the military, small business, organized labor, or banks, you're now historic low in confidence by the American people, according to Gallup poll last year.
Yeah, and that's a trend that political scientists have been tracking for 30 years. The declining trust, not just in government, but in all major institutions in society. And that is a troubling trend, and I mean it potentially does have negative implications for the political system. The question is there anything that can be done to reverse that?
Right.
How that, or at least partially how that faith and trust is and built is, and I think it is a faith, a belief that those institutions aren't going to play favorites, that they are, upholding the norms and the processes that we all agree on. And I think there's less and less of that faith these days. Even if you take an institution like higher education, which of course I'm intimately involved in, I mean, we're seeing a huge split, like a partisan split. I mean, increasingly Republicans are just not very happy with higher education and just don't retain a lot of faith in it. They don't think higher education is treating conservatives or the general notion and policy ideas and values of conservatism really well.
Right.
And, and higher education, for lack of a better terms, to put it kind of crudely, is seen as a liberal institution. The courts, I think, increasingly, at least on the left, are being seen as a conservative institution. And that's not good. That is not good when we're looking at institutions of sort of like, and asking them, which side do you support?
What side are you on as an entire industry?
Or which side are you advocating for? Which team are you with?
That's right. Just for the audience here, not trying to be Dr. Negative, sorry. This is from Gallup, going from 1979 to 2023. Almost a 40-year period shows a total lack and consistent drop of faith across all major U.S. institutions. We got to go back to pre-1979. So this shows definitively it's getting worse, and it's gotten worse every year, and it's never really gotten better. And the thing that got me or brought my attention to it was there's a theory called tyranny of the minority. You might hear some constitutional scholars bring this up. So what they're bringing up was recently, I'm in California, and when Roe v. Wade was overturned, people here did not handle it very well. They were really, really, really upset and scared and frightened. And what they started saying was Donald Trump was not popularly elected. And then a majority of the Supreme Court that represents a minority of the population, because they were small rural states, put in place 3 Supreme Court justices who changed the entire legal system to be the most conservative, radical it's been since the 1970s, or about a 45-year period retrograde. And they're going, this is our democracy where you're not popularly elected, and then people who represent a minority of the population because they're in the Senate can have the Supreme Court come in and reflect the total opposite will of the majority of the people. And that's completely democratic, and that recently happened, and it's all legal. Is that a system that you think will continue to build faith of the American people, given how low faith is already and is declining over the last 45 years?
Well, there's an awful lot to unpack there. I
Fair
mean,
enough, fair enough.
you know, and part of it is with the Electoral College. I mean, we have this kind of goofy system of electing a chief executive.
Sure.
And I mean, the simple fact is, I mean, you don't have to like it, but in 2016, Donald Trump won the presidency fair and square. He didn't win the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College vote. And under our system, it is the Electoral College that decides the president, not the popular vote. You know, if I wanted to sort of like push back or at least give some context to, you know, the real point that you're making, you know, this notion of the tyranny of the minority is one of the reasons we have a system set up the way that we have it set up is, you know, the founding fathers weren't too wild about majorities.
Fair enough.
Because, you know, majorities can be, you know, if you like look at Jim Crow states, I mean, majorities certainly supported those systems. So, I mean, I'm not sure that a majority is necessarily a savior or a solution. I mean, I think the best that we can hope for is, I mean, I think to the extent that I can fathom, I think right now we still have robust institutions, resilient institutions. And I think that's a hopeful thing, because that gives the entire system the ability to course correct without falling apart. The thing that would concern me is if those institutions and the norms surrounding them get so frayed that they essentially collapse. Yeah, that's when I think bad things can happen. And, you know, and looking at that trend line that you have up there, which is something political scientists have been following, like I said, for 30 years and becoming increasingly concerned about it, is, you know, how low can that number go and the institutions remain resilient?
That's the question.
Part of the, you know, uncertainty of our future is we may get to find that out.
Professor, aren't you completely confident that we'll work everything out? Haven't we had tough times before? And come on, we'll just get over this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I am not pessimistic, but I'm not Pollyannish. You know, I'm trying to take a realist's view here, and not just a realist view of the institutions, but a realist view of democracy. I think a lot of a lot of what people are exposed to and a lot of what people view as, you know, the mainstream political conversation, it's actually taking place right now between two fairly small groups. I still think a majority of Americans, are not as attentive to politics as people like me think they are.
Fair
Uh,
enough.
and I think a majority of Americans are still pretty reasonable and pragmatic. I think one of the things that is, uh, exacerbating this whole situation is that, we're moving into, demographics are changing. It's not just public institutions that are, sort of like shaking right now. Institutions that have promoted social cohesion, the obvious ones are religion and the traditional family, are fading and reforming and coming into different forms. How much of a part does that play in creating sort of like a ferment where it's harder to bring stability to the institutions that govern and control the political process? I mean,
I wonder.
America is just such a, it's always been a pretty diverse place, right? And, nation,
Sure.
it's melting pot, all that. It's just that we've got a pot, all right, but it's a pot that's getting stirred rather than, a lot of melting going on. And I think if there was some, I have no idea how you do this, but some way to sort of like get people to accept a common story, a vision of America that is positive and most people can buy into it. The last politician I can think of who really did this effectively was actually Ronald Reagan, where,
Wow.
love him or hate him, the whole Morning in America thing.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
it's, Tip O'Neill is like, well, what can I say? I disagree with him about everything, but I love the guy,
It worked. Highly
Yeah,
polarized, but
it
it
worked.
worked. It worked.
And that sounds, it sounds kind of trivial, like there's a lack of substance there, but I think it really is sort of like that, sort of like some sort of unifying story or myth.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But I don't know how effectively we seem to be in the process of losing that, and what we can do to replace it or tell ourselves a new story. Well, your guess is as good as mine.
Professor, we talked about this. I'm only absolute total answers that will fix America we're doing today. That's a joke. This is a complex issue. I make it a little bit light. I want people to understand this is complex. And when you talk to the people who are studying it, nobody's saying, this is the problem, here's the solution. If we just did it, everything's fixed. Nobody's saying that. They're going, I think this will work. Here's these other factors. We need to think about X, Y, and Z. Try it, have more experiments. Again, not to be a Debbie Downer, Christian Science Monitor, How Americans Lost Trust in Elections and Why That Matters. Historic low faith in American elections. Less than half of America, only 44%, believes or has confidence the vote will be accurate in 2024. Less than half of the entire country. How do we fix this? How do we get, you're talking about lack of a common story. How do we get back to where people have faith in these institutions? We reverse this trend line going back 45 years, and we start to have a common story with each other. That's why I was getting at Joe Biden says, oh, I'm going to be the person to bring America together, and I'm going to get everybody to heal. Total failure. So if Joe Biden couldn't do it, who's that person, elected official, robot, I don't know, alien species, who's going to come down here and have a narrative that we're all going to buy, and that's going to get 44 to maybe now 65% of the population actually believes that our system works? Who does that? When do they come and save us, Professor?
And I'm not sure that there's any one person that's going to come save us. And here's what I tell students when I get asked questions like this. In a functioning representative democracy, you get exactly the government you deserve. because ultimately, who runs this system? Of voters. And, rather than looking externally, who's going to save us, from them, there's no us, there's no them, there's just us. And if what you needed to do in order to win an election was to be a reasonable person who acted with civility and comity to those who disagreed with them, you know what politicians would do? They'd do exactly that. Because one of the things political scientists have figured out pretty definitively is we know what motivates legislative and electoral behavior. And ultimately, politicians will respond to what the big messages that voters get them. And if, ranting about, the election was rigged, if that is like, if I don't win, it's a complete stitch up. If that's what gets you votes, then that's what they're going to say. If what gets you votes is, here's my policies, here's what I think, I believe in America. If I win the election, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to shake my opponent's hand and roll up my sleeves and get to work. If I lose, I absolutely will bear the loser's burden and lick my wounds and sort of like try to reload for the next election. If voters rewarded that sort of behavior, I'm pretty positive that's the sort of behavior that would get in politicians. So rather than someone coming down to save us, I think if we're going to send out a hopeful, actionable message, it should be, it's up to the voters, which is perfectly appropriate in a democracy.
We have to save ourselves. We the people, you watching this, not your elected official, not the person on TV, you, the individual, the voter, has to be the patriot, has to be the one to lead the charge. Is that fair?
That's fair enough.
How do we get the people to react to that? So right now, what I'm saying is Donald Trump uses a lot of vitriol and tough language, and it works. But when I look at the Democrats, I watch MSNBC and I see them go on TV and say, Donald Trump wins, this is the last election we'll ever have. Donald Trump wins, democracy's over. If Donald Trump wins, they will literally round up the gays. Yes, they said that on MSNBC. Is that the kind of language that gets us to a mature discussion about elections?
Well, obviously, no, that is not the language that gets us to a mature discussion, but that is the language that gets attention. And one more time is if MSNBC is saying that stuff and everybody just turns it off, won't listen to it.
Sure.
I guarantee you. I mean,
right.
we bashed on The Economist and the notion of rational man at the beginning of this conversation. One of the things where I'm in 100% agreement with The Economist is incentives matter. And, the difficulty here is acting, if you're one person out of millions of voters, it's sort of like, what difference can I make? And the only honest answer is not much. But if it's not one voter, but it's millions of voters who are acting collectively, that absolutely can make a difference. The entire system is set up so those sorts of differences can be made.
I hope so. I just, I just remember, what was it? Kamala Harris would come on recently after the second assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and she would say, I was an attorney general and a prosecutor. I prosecuted international transnational gangs. I prosecuted rapists. I prosecuted pedophiles. So hear me when I say, quote, I know Donald Trump's type. That's inferring that Trump's a pedophile and a rapist. That was her major campaign ad, and that was after the second attempt on his life. Not good, right, for calming things down?
Yeah, no, and I mean, the rhetoric that comes out that is essentially been normed it's not good for the system. I mean, one of the differences that I talk about in some of my classes, in the 1990s, I spent a lot of time telling my undergraduates, you need to pay more attention to politics because politics is important.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the era when the wall had come down, the Cold War ended.
Right. Right.
Francis Fukuyama, and it's the end of history and
In
all that.
history.
And then, you fast forward 30 years, and what I'm telling my students is like, politics isn't that important. You should, if it's putting you on anti-anxiety medication, maybe you need to
Yeah.
turn off the TV and step away from
Right.
social media. But again, that comes down to, in some ways, it's not just that we hold the key to changing it. In some ways, we're doing this to ourselves. If we are, if this headline pops up in our social media feed, and that's the click that we go for. That's the thing that gets a response. People are going to keep putting out that kind of rhetoric.
I'm just saying there was 2 attempts at killing this man, and the very next thing was AOC and Kamala going, I know his type, and inferring that he's a pedophile and a rapist. And I'm like, if he is, you have to prove that in court before you can say that about a person. You can't just make these things up. That's not the way the law works. That's not the way decency works. While I'm not a fan of him, this seems like pouring gasoline on a fire after a second time this guy almost got his head shut off.
And
That's pretty healthy, right?
In my opinion, the only mature, legitimate response, if you fundamentally believe in liberal democracy, to someone trying to assassinate a political candidate, whether you love them or hate them, they're a legitimate political candidate. The only legitimate response to that is to say that is wrong, and we should not support that. That is 100% wrong. Period. Full stop. End of story. That our system should have no place to trying to resolve differences through violence. That is antithetical to a democratic process. We count heads. We don't break them. And if you are even sort of like hinting that breaking heads is a legitimate option, you are in effect arguing against a legitimate democratic process. And and if you're going to defend the democratic process and sort of like really say, this is a first principle for me, this is what I'm going to defend, then you also got to be prepared to lose.
Right. To be a good loser, right? Yeah. I'm not saying that a professor introduced that. You have to be a good loser. You can't go sour. I lost, I'll win next time.
Yep. And I know these things are easy to say. And, after elections, I'm no different than anyone else. It's sort of like when my favorite football team loses, it's sort of like, there's a certain amount of grumpiness in my house. But also like a football team, they'll be playing again soon. I'll get another shot at it.
So this we're winding down. This is kind of gets at you basically broached one of the last questions I wanted to ask, which is Kamala Harris absolutely said violence is wrong. The assassination attempts on Trump are wrong. Violence has no place in politics. She did. And then she also compared Trump to a pedophile and a rapist at the same time. So my question to you is one I've been asking a lot of people, because I've seen this debate in the public, but I'm not seeing it by people with psychology degrees or psychologists or psychoanalysts or people who even study the human mind. Does existential threat language have the same capacity to compel a person to violence as violent language? For example, Democrats are saying, oh, well, there was 2 assassination attempts on Trump. We had nothing to do with that, and we are completely guilt-free because we never used violent language. Only Trump used violent language. So therefore, he's responsible for creating a violent climate because we never used violent language. Other people are saying, right, but you also said democracy ends if Trump's elected. This will be the last election ever if Trump's elected. All the gay people will be rounded up if Trump's elected. Your favorite newscasters will be disappeared in the prisons or probably executed if he's elected. Oh, and he's Hitler and the end of America. So my question to you is, this is the one I ask. You're sitting next to me, right? We're in 2 lawn chairs and we're looking across the street. And I see a guy across the street. And I tell you, oh, professor, you know what? I'd like to go beat that guy up. Really just kick him and punch him in the face. If you and I go beat him up, we're both liable. And I'm especially liable because I was using violent rhetoric. Okay. New scenario. You and I are sitting in the chair. Guy walks across the street. I turn to you and I say, Professor, I'm not saying what to do, but if that guy's around tomorrow, he said he was going to kill your wife, your dog, your children, your family, and your grandma, and burn down your house. Do whatever you want with that. I'm taking off later. Does that compel a person to violence too?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm the person who's qualified to answer sort of like, what sort of like vague subliminal motivation a particular rhetorical spin will give people.
Okay.
I mean, I think the only thing that I can really say to respond to that is whether it's, an open appeal to violence, or it's a more subtle sideways smearing of your opponent in a way that, provides a hint that, the world might be a better place if something happened to this guy. Is neither categories of those rhetoric are, they simply don't reflect well on the people who are making those statements.
So both are, we should stay away from both.
Yeah, because essentially
Okay.
what it is, effectively that is almost an appeal to the mob, and that's not helpful. It's not constructive.
Okay. Well, I had to ask because you have a psychology background.
Well,
I have seen
political psychology.
political psychology background. Fine. I've seen 14 different people come on television who have no psychology background, no political psychology background, no sociology background. They have nothing like that. And they say definitively, existential threats cannot compel a person to violence, period. Can't happen. Human brain doesn't work that way. Only violent language does. And I go, isn't that interesting that people who do not have a background in the human mind are taking a very distinct position on this issue, which you sort of demur to because you said, hey, I'm not exactly qualified. Why are many people who are not qualified taking a hard stance on this and telling us it's this way and that when they don't have a psychology background?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, and I think there's a lot of
Is that
people out
fair?
there who are essentially claiming expertise that they do not. Um, and one of the things that I think is getting left out there is like making these. I, I think it's debatable whether things are that clear cut, simply because it's not just the rhetoric. You have to get into the psychology of the people who are receiving the message. And that message is not going to be, certainly what I can say is that sort of message is not going to be received the same way by every individual. That
Okay.
there is going to be individual level variation and what that message means and the inference that people take from that message. Now,
Okay.
I mean, I'm not qualified. I'm certainly not a clinical psychologist or even a cognitive psychologist. Could some people infer from these hints is sort of like basically what they're saying is, if you're on the side of the good, you should, go shoot this person or something. But it wouldn't surprise me if that did happen. I mean, the example that I was thinking of is that guy who showed up to that pizzeria because he thought Hillary Clinton was running
Right.
well. I mean,
Right.
it was like bizarre, absurd stuff.
Yeah.
But this guy, had heard these messages, and bless his heart, his motivation seemed principled in the sense of, God, somebody needs to go up there and save these kids, and I have to shoot somebody to do it. So be it. And I don't think anyone was saying, go up to this pizzeria and start blasting away. It was, there was sort of like these hints that there was some sort of nefarious shenanigans going on that the Clintons were involved with. So, I mean, I think most people listen to that sort of message and were like, yeah, that's loopy. That just doesn't, that just strains credulity. But clearly there's at least a couple of people out there who's like, yeah, somebody needs to grab a gun and do something about that.
Sure. And that's a great point. I'd forgotten about that Republicans used existential rhetoric, that the Democrats were running a pedophile pizza ring. And then you did have this guy go and try to shoot it up. could we then play the reverse? What if Republicans never put that message out there?
Well,
Would
and
that guy
that,
still
yeah,
have been gone and shot up the place?
and sort of like trying to establish what would happen in the negative case is,
Right.
I mean, it's always a speculative exercise. I mean, I think in that particular
Fair
instance,
enough.
that particular guy probably wouldn't have done it, but I mean, who knows? I mean, one thing that
Fair
we
enough.
can say for sure though is that I mean, the effect of this kind of rhetoric is, I mean, it's all negative, right? It's negative in the sense that basically what you are is you are, I mean, like purely from a political frame, basically what you're trying to do is demonize your opponent, and you're trying to effectively persuade people not to go out and support them. I mean, that's essentially from a political standpoint the objective. And I mean,
Sure.
is that a healthy way to sort of like run a democracy? My opponent is evil, and that
Right.
reflects on you if you vote for them.
Right.
I mean, I keep coming back to John McCain's example, and there's
Right.
plenty of instances with John McCain's record where you can sort of like say, well, that wasn't such a good example, but in that particular instance, a very high profile example where there's an obvious motive to go along with the sort of rhetoric that you're talking about, and his response is, no, I'm not going there. I'm absolutely not going there. And I mean, I don't want to over-egg this anyway, but
No, he was a great man for saying that. Many people have brought up that that was an example of the kind of leadership that we need, and we just don't see anymore.
and
A
you
lot of
even
people have
sort
said
of
that.
a little bit of that in the vice presidential debate that we just
Sure.
had
Oh,
with
fair enough. Fair enough. Vice
Pence and
presidential
Walz.
debate, yes.
Yeah,
There was an
two
attempt.
Midwestern
Absolutely.
guys, and sort of like Midwestern values are sort of showing through there. I mean, it can be done.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
It clearly can be done. But to get back to what we were talking about earlier, ultimately, I think it's the voters that have to provide the incentives for individuals who are running for office to behave that way.
I'm just wondering how much worse it gets. We can't have a coherent national narrative that existential threat language and violent language, maybe we should put both of them away. So I've interviewed 2 professors so far who told me, yeah, I have a psychology background, and yeah, violent existential rhetoric can compel a person to violence, but Trump's that evil, so it's okay to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
That's not safe, right? That's not stable
right. But
thinking.
I mean, one of the things that I think gives me a slightly different perspective on this is, I'm in academia. I'm around a lot of pretty liberal, progressive people.
Sure,
And socialized with a
sure.
lot of them. But I've also got, friends and relatives who are dyed-in-the-wool MAGA people. And,
Me too.
I hang around and socialize with both of them. They're all good, decent people.
Thank you. Thank you.
And it's sort of like, when I go down to see friends and family in Texas, I'm kind of like the strange guy who parachutes out of academia to see them. And then when I come back, I'm sort of like this weird guy who is, dragging some of that Texas viewpoint with me into the ivory tower. And the bottom line is it's all good. I mean, the people who are reflective and wrapped up in the sort of like rhetoric that you're talking about, I have no doubt. I think you're 100% correct, Marcus. That there's plenty of them out there, but I don't think that's most people. I think most people are people, and you might disagree with them. It's like I've said to a number of my relatives. It's like, I'm not getting into an argument with you. I love you. I'm not letting politics divide us.
Trying to find the study. There was some study that I'm trying to find. It was showing basically, like, it was by the Sabato Crystal Ball Center out of the University of Virginia School for Politics, and they had done a survey about 2 years ago. and they were showing like 78 and 80% of all registered Republicans and all registered Democrats viewed the other side, quote, as a existential threat.
Yep.
Which, I mean, that's the kind of way that we described a Russian nuclear attack in the 1980s or ISIS committing another terrorist bombing in the 2000s. And now we use that language for roughly 80% of both parties when they're describing the other side. That can't be good for stability, correct, Professor?
No, it can't be good for stability, but there was a big study that came out not that long ago that took a bunch of interventions that were sort of like trying to bridge that divide, like Democrats viewing Republicans as evil and Republicans doing the same to Democrats. And one of the most effective interventions to lower the temperature and sort of like decrease what we call affective, emotional, political polarization, was to ask people, what do you think Republicans believe about immigration?
Right.
And then show them, well, actually, this is what Republicans think about immigration. What do you think Democrats think about immigration? Well, actually, this is what Democrats think about immigration. And that had an effect in the sense that it sort of like put in front of people, this is my position, and it's not the same as the position of the people who I disagree with politically, but holy cow, it's a lot closer than I thought. They're not nearly as extreme as I thought.
Right.
And I think if you force yourself out of a bubble and interact with people who disagree with you in just sort of like a relaxed social sense, I think that's a way to sort of like integrate that kind of intervention just into your daily life. Yeah, if you're a Democrat, go hug a Republican. If you're a Republican, go hug a Democrat.
Well, but you also talked about how those simple encounter things don't necessarily get someone to change their political view.
You're not going to change your politics. I don't think. Persuading somebody to think differently. It's like I seriously doubt you're going to sort of like persuade a conservative to become liberal or vice versa. I think what you might be able to do is to get a conservative to think, well, these progressives aren't quite as bad or as extreme as I thought they were. You're going to get a progressive to think, well, these conservatives, they're actually pretty good people. They're community oriented. They're good parents. Pillars of their community sort of people. And I think that's enough. I mean, I'm at least from where I'm sitting, knowing what I've learned about the psychology of most people's politics and where they're coming from, I think that's enough. That is, if we can all get to that point, that's enough to make, to lubricate the machinery of the democratic process and keep it trundling along.
Fair enough. There it is. This was the article. Center for Politics new initiative explores deep, persistent divide between Biden and Trump voters, came out in 2021. I have come to view elected officials from the opposition party as presenting a clear and present danger to American democracy. 80% of Biden voters somewhat agree. 84% of Trump voters somewhat agree. But you're right. Maybe if we could reduce the temperature, then we could avoid another January 6th. I'm most concerned about January 6th, part 2 and part 3, simply because it caught everyone off guard. And that tells me that no one's really qualified to say that we can for sure say there won't be a second one.
Yeah.
And I'm also worried about this thing called Bleeding Kansas. A lot of people look at the Civil War and they go, well, we could never get there. The Civil War didn't just happen. There was a 10-year period called Bleeding Kansas before the Civil War, where people in the North and people in the South were getting routine headlines about, so Northerners and Southerners moved into the Kansas territory. They wanted it a slave state, not slave state. So what they did was they started walking up and shooting each other in the face in front of their kids. Yep. And then you'd hear a newspaper article would go to the North. Southern man executed Northern man, shot him in the face in front of his daughter and wife. Then you'd see a newspaper article go to the South. Northern man shot Southern man and his daughter right in front of the church. That went on for 10 years. So people in the South and North were desensitized to the idea of others killing them, fellow Americans, and started to build hate. These people are going to kill and murder me, and no one's going to do anything about it. And then 10 years after that, you had the Civil War. Are we building our bleeding Kansas period now?
Well, I think one of the potential arguments against that, or one of the reasons why that might not happen, is because we've got the lessons of history and maybe we can learn from them. I mean, the fact of the conversation that we're having, I think reflects. I think I can speak for both of us on this. That's a lesson that we should learn, and we should not repeat the mistakes that we've made in the past, and that getting too far out in terms of essentially self-feeding our perceptions of the other side's extremism is something that we need to take seriously if we're going to avoid those painful and difficult lessons of history.
I hope so. What I'm really looking forward to someone to say, here's the answer, and I know this definitively can't happen or could happen. And it's a lot of, I hope, and we have the ability to fix this, but it's going to require some effort. All the public's going to have to get involved. Professor, if all the public's going to have to get involved to fix this, we're looking at a generational project, right?
Yeah.
Like not next year. We're talking like a 10 to 15, 20-year project.
Yep.
How do we know? I'm sorry to be a broken record. How do we know January 6, 2, 3, 4, 5 don't happen in that 10 to 15-year period where the public wakes up?
Well, and I hate to be a broken record, but Marcus, the only honest answer I have to that question that you keep posing is I don't know.
Okay.
All right. I get that that's not a satisfying answer. It's not satisfying to me.
I love your honesty. You've been very frank. I love it. Just for everybody here, there's a picture of bleeding Kansas. I was not exaggerating. This was a person at the scene who drew it. That's how they took pictures at the time. And there's people shooting other people point blank without guns in their hand and in front of their kids. So it was pretty bad. That went on for 10 years. Nobody's brought to justice. Both sides did it. And that led us to a point where people were so angry they just couldn't calm down again. And then when I see stats like this, I've come to view elected officials as the other party as a clear and present danger to America. We're looking at 80% for both parties. Yeah, that was a few years ago, but I'm of the opinion things haven't calmed down. Professor, final thoughts. You've answered a lot of questions. You've been very frank. You've been very honest. It really helps the public understand. It really helps me understand. Thank you. Somebody's watching this video. They're not you. They're not me. And they're saying, wow, I learned a lot. I thought you could just go do an encounter and everything, poof, fixed. Now I know you can't. But there was a lot of material and I'm struggling to remember it all. But the professor of political science and political psychology said this one thing, and it was the most important thing he felt for people to understand about political polarization in America. What is that one thought you want people to not be able to forget 5 days after they watch this video? The thought that's so critical for an average American to understand, to comprehend, and potentially solve this national problem, Professor.
The one thought would be that I would want people to stick with is we're not as polarized as you think we are, in the sense of your view of the extremity of the people that you disagree with is probably incorrect, at least in a broad sense.
So people have a worse opinion of the other side
Yep.
than actually is fair. So
absolutely.
So Democrats think Republicans don't care about democracy by like 60%. And it's actually like 40%. And vice versa, where it's just they're not as bad. They're not the boogeymen you say that they are.
Yeah, that's precisely it. And I mean, you can always find an example of the boogeymen to confirm your priors, but that is typically not representative of the people on the other side of the political aisle. And to put it in even more succinct terms, is you're closer to the other side than you think you are.
Ooh, that's good. That's very good. Just got to say, for my relatives in Texas, my family's also from Texas. So when you were talking about going back to Texas, yeah, half the family's from Texas. Here's a little factoid for both political parties. Latin people in California don't vote or act like Latin people in Texas. I've had conversations with my cousins, and they think some of the stuff we do out here is bizarre.
Yeah, and I can confirm that as a political scientist.
I'm just, so they're like, oh, where's the Latin voter going to go? Probably where the rest of everybody else in that region votes. Yeah. They tend to blend in and adopt the attitudes of the area. Yeah. Thank you for coming out. I hope you found that this was a fair interview. I'll send you a copy of the video. You don't have to name anybody, but we always ask for recommendations. If you know anybody who might be open to a fair conversation, we hope you felt this was a fair combo. I'll send you a copy of the video soon, and I'll ask you for recommendations then, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine, Marcus. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Professor. This ends our show, and I want to say thank you for coming out, and I'll email you shortly, and I really appreciate it.
All righty. Thank you. Good talking to you, Marcus.